The story of 16-year-old Joe Clark, a little-known criminal whose actions shocked society, deserves attention. This story contains descriptions of violent acts, including the torture of a child. Readers who are sensitive to such topics should refrain from reading this text. The author has tried to use restrained language to soften the narrative. Joe Clark, a teenager whose life took a dark turn, became the perpetrator of tragic events. His crimes, committed at such a young age, stand out for their cruelty and raise questions about the nature of evil. The story of 16-year-old Joe Clark, whose crimes shook the small town of Baraboo, Wisconsin, contains scenes of violence and cruelty. Those who are not prepared for such descriptions should refrain from reading. At an age when most teenagers seek adventure in harmless pranks, Joe Clark found pleasure in tormenting others. His victims, young residents of the town, became part of the dark secret he kept. If it weren't for the resilience of one of his victims, Ted Phillips, Clark's crimes could have continued and escalated into a series of murders. On the 4th of July, 1994, 14-year-old Chris Steiner disappeared in Baraboo. His parents discovered his absence late at night and immediately called the police. The teenager's bedroom was in disarray. The windows were wide open, there were dirty boot prints on the carpet and windowsill, and the balcony door was unlocked. The police began a search, but 6 days later, Chris's body was found in the Wisconsin River. An examination revealed water in his lungs, indicating drowning. No injuries were found on his body, and investigators concluded that the teenager had run away from home and died accidentally. The residents of Baraboo, where violent crimes were rare, accepted this version, hoping that the tragedy would not be repeated. However, the criminal responsible for Chris's death lived among them and waited for a new opportunity. On the morning of July 29, 1995, he struck again. 13-year-old Ted Phillips, who had recently moved to Baraboo with his family, fell asleep in front of the TV in the living room. During the night, the teenager felt himself being lifted off the couch. Half asleep, he thought his father was carrying him to his bedroom, but he soon realized that he was being carried outside. In the darkness, Ted couldn't see his abductor, and at first thought it was someone his father knew. To the teenager's horror, it turned out to be Joe Clark. He took Ted to his house, which was only a kilometer away from the Phillips home. Ted's mother noticed her son was missing at 5 in the morning and raised the alarm. Ted's parents were frantically searching for their son. They searched the neighborhood, checked the river where his father had once taken him fishing, and looked in neighboring yards. But the teenager was nowhere to be found. The family contacted the police. Meanwhile, Ted woke up in a strange house. When the kidnapper turned on the light, the 13-year-old boy saw that he was not facing an adult, but a teenager much larger than himself. Joe Clark tried to win over his victim. He joked, offered him a drink, and showed him his collection of baseball bats. Ted, reassured by this, decided that he was dealing with a friendly guy. The illusion of safety collapsed in an instant. Clark suddenly grabbed Ted's ankle and broke it with a crunch. The teenager almost lost consciousness from the pain. Trying to escape, he limped toward the exit, but his tormentor caught up with him, breaking his other ankle and hip. For many hours, Clark methodically inflicted injuries, twisting and crushing Ted's limbs. The teenager screamed in pain, but the torture continued. Once, in response to a question from his victim, Clark said coldly, "I like the sound of breaking bones." His words made Ted shudder. After 10 hours of torture, Clark left, confident that his wounded captive would not escape. But he was wrong. Ted, overcoming the pain, crawled down the stairs, clinging to the steps with his hands. He lost consciousness several times, but continued to move toward the kitchen, where the phone was located. In the living room, the teenager froze when he heard Clark return. Pressing himself to the floor, he tried to hide behind the sofa. But the kidnapper found him and resumed his torture. Ted's limbs were mutilated, his joints swollen from bruising, and his body was giving out from the pain. On the evening of July 30th, Clark locked Ted in the closet and left again. In the cramped space, tormented by pain and thirst, the teenager fought for his life. He knew his strength was running out. The day before, Clark had confessed to killing Chris Steiner. This thought spurred Ted on. In the darkness of the closet, he found an old wooden guitar. Gathering his remaining strength, the teenager broke down the door. Realizing that he had no time to lose, he crawled to the kitchen, where the phone was. Every meter was an inhuman struggle. Rolling down the stairs, Ted lost consciousness from the pain. When he woke up, he was afraid that he had lost precious time. But his will to live pushed him forward. Reaching the kitchen, the teenager noticed a telephone with a long cord. He jerked it down onto the floor and dialed the emergency number. More than a day of torment did not break his spirit, and he heard the operator's voice on the other end of the line. The police officer who took the call initially thought it was a prank. Ted spoke calmly, explaining that he had been kidnapped and could not move. The operator kept him on the line while the police established the address. Officers quickly arrived at the Clarks' house. Inside, chaos reigned. Piles of trash and dirty clothes were scattered everywhere. The police were shocked by the sight of the 13-year-old teenager. His limbs were mutilated, his face contorted with pain, and his strength was leaving his body with every passing minute. Everyone who learned Ted Phillips' story was amazed by his courage. At the age of 13, he showed incredible resilience, surviving horrors that changed his life forever. At the hospital, doctors were shocked by the severity of the teenager's injuries. His life was hanging by a thread. Months of treatment and numerous operations failed to completely rid Ted of the effects of his ordeal. But he survived. At that time, Joe Clark, unaware that his victim had been saved, was enjoying himself at a party. That's where the police arrested him. During a search of his home, they found a notebook with a list of names that pointed to plans for new crimes. A few days later, Ted, having regained consciousness, told investigators that he had heard Clark mention the names of 2 murdered teenagers. However, due to the trauma he had suffered, he could not remember their surnames. He only remembered that one began with the letter C. Ted's father, sitting by his bed in intensive care, began reading the surnames from the phone book. When the surname Steiner was mentioned, Ted confirmed that this was the name Clark had given him. With this information, the police reopened the Chris Steiner case. After the teenager's body was exhumed, an X-ray showed that his legs were broken in multiple places, just like Ted's. It became clear that Chris had suffered the same torment, but did not survive. Clark was convicted of the attempted murder of Ted Phillips. He admitted to the kidnapping but denied the torture, citing memory lapses. On November 7, 1997, he was found guilty of the murder of Chris Steiner and sentenced to 100 years in prison without the right to appeal. Ted Phillips grew up and remained in Baraboo. He became a tall and attractive young man, but the more than 24 hours of torment he endured left a mark on his life. Ted never remembered the last name of the second teenager mentioned by Clark.